John Oakes is the co-founder and publisher of Or Books, a New York-based independent publisher established in 2009. The company sells digital and print-on-demand books directly to customers and focuses on, quote, creative promotion through traditional media and the internet. On their website, it states that Or Books embraces progressive change in politics, culture, and the way we do business. It eschews selling through bookstores. John is also the publisher of the Evergreen Review. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel. It's an honor to be speaking with you.
We are going to be talking about Rosset, My Life in Publishing and How I Fought Censorship. That's Barney's memoir that you published in 2016. So I'll just start with a brief thumbnail of Barney here. Barney Rosset was the owner of Grove Press. He bought it for $3,000 in 1951. He was also the publisher and editor-in-chief of the magazine Evergreen Review. And you are also the publisher of that currently,
Yes,
correct?
I am.
Yeah. He led a successful legal battle to publish the uncensored version of D.H. Lawrence's novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, and later published Henry Miller's controversial novel, The Tropic of Cancer. The right to publish it was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1964 in a landmark ruling for free speech and the First Amendment. Okay, so I'm just going to read out a paragraph from the very beginning of Rosset, of his memoir. It's not titled anything. It's not called a foreword or a preface or an introduction. It's just there with a picture of kind of a grainy picture of Barney with his father. Just to put it in perspective, it's the notes for an autobiography that he wrote in 2006, and it's to be found at the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at Columbia University. XX was a fierce competitor, and he's talking about himself here, was a fierce competitor in school, but not for money. I guess that's because his father had a lot of it. Only for prestige of scholarship, athletics, and above all else, girls. This struggle to get girls has been a deep-rooted problem, and he felt, rather mistakenly, that he could never be successful. This competition for girls was a very subtle thing, taking many forms, and also being a very chauvinistic thing in that the girl was basically a prize to be sought after, not an important human being. So that's really interesting that he would start off his memoir with that.
Yeah, I think this sense of struggle and competition is integral to understanding Barney Rosset. You know, he, in my opinion, I think he's one of the most significant cultural figures in the United States to emerge in the post-war period. He isn't a sort of he's not a peaceful figure by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. He comes out, he starts fighting, and he ended fighting, and in the middle he was fighting, and when he wasn't fighting he was restless and bouncing around.
Why does he focus on women to start with? Like he was married 5 times. He starts off his memoir basically sort of saying, hey, I got laid a lot. He wanted to let you know that, almost like he had to prove his manhood somehow. That's how he begins the book, and it's quite a big part of the book.
His father had, I'm answering the question, but I'm obviously not a psychologist, or maybe not obviously, but I'm not one. But I think,
even though you're in Switzerland now.
Yeah, I am the land of Jung, but I think Barney came into this world very much overshadowed by his father, who had made a considerable fortune in Chicago as a banker, and had a really, I think by our standards, what you'd have to call an unloving relationship with him. And the father completely overshadowed him financially. And I would guess that one way he felt he could outshine his father, I mean, this may be going, I can just feel the Rosset spirit over my shoulder saying, oh, that's a lot of bullshit, John, but was just having the succession of conquests. And it is true that he was constantly, but he also, this also might have been a side effect of this. He had this vivacity about him. I don't want to overstate this animal quality that he had, but anyone who met him surely would have experienced that. He had in a sort, its mildest form, it's called charisma, but with Barney, it was really palpable. And as you and I were just saying a few minutes ago, actually physically, he was unimposing. He was a very small man.
Then maybe he's trying to prove something too with that.
Yeah, and I think that also extended to his publishing, that where limits were set by the government or society, as soon as he felt or saw a limit, he wanted to break it. So that tied also into his interest into what he called erotica, and I think the rest of us would call pornography. And he absolutely loved that stuff.
He loved to read it, or he
loved to read it. Yeah, he loved to read it. He loved to put it out into the world. He loved to shock people. Unlike somebody like Hugh Hefner, who I guess was a contemporary of his, or other people, he really didn't end up making a lot of money off of it. He made quite a bit of money off it, but then blew it all on tons and tons of lawyers, I believe some bad investments, but mostly it was just regular book publishing, which is not a very profitable business in the best of times.
It's interesting too, I've noticed, having interviewed quite a number of publishers over the years, it's quite striking how proud he is of his time during the war, World War II, in China. Jack McClellan up here in Canada, and also Gordon Graham in England, they both see that as one of the best times of their lives.
Absolutely. And in his memoir, in fact, the original version of his memoir, we cut it drastically, but the original version, I don't want to make it up, but I'd say about a third of it was devoted to his time in China, where he was a war photographer. He was, I don't want to say obsessed, but it certainly loomed large in his mind. And people are interested in hearing about him now. They want to know about his relationship with Genet, or Jean Genet, or Beckett, or Kenzaburo Oe, or
all of these Nobel Prize winners that he published.
Right, and Ionesco, and his first wife, Joan Mitchell, the great abstract expressionist, and so on. But he really wanted to talk about China. Being Barney, he was not, he certainly was not a reasonable man, and you couldn't come to a resolution. It was really, you did what he wanted or you didn't do it. And so that large measure why it was only after his death in 2012 that the memoir was published a few years later.
I guess we forget, that these experiences are very formative, and I suppose there's this sense of purpose, there's this camaraderie.
But also, if I may be a little bit devil's advocate here, there's a lot, on the one hand, there's a great deal of responsibility. On the other hand, you don't have to worry about rent and putting food on your plate. or
Yeah.
taking care of a family,
Yeah.
or how you're going to pay your employees. You know, you're given a job, and you basically are going to have the resources to do it, and you stay within those parameters more or less. And in Barney's case, he had a job that really suited his free-ranging personality. He was a photographer, and really took some wonderful pictures, some of which are reproduced in the book. And there were many more we didn't include, but he really had an eye which came out of his compassion for the suffering he saw amongst the Chinese citizens, and really, I think, some unforgettable images that he came up with. And in fact, he was, I think, he was heading in that direction. He was planning to be a photographer, to do something in film, when he got diverted, thankfully, for the rest of us.
Yeah, a couple things then. Was he trained as a photographer or not? No, he just went out there and started taking photographs.
Yeah. And his father, had plenty of connections, and he could have secured a stateside commission, as they used to say, but he really wanted to be in the thick of it. But his political commitment was clear from the outset, even from his high school days.
Yeah, he was the editor of this, is it Communist or
something like that?
Communist and Socialism.
Yeah. The army had dossiers on his clearly socialist or at the time communist leanings, and that again could be seen as certainly would go against his ultra-capitalist father. But whatever the roots of that, the end result was this extraordinary, flawed as we all are, but individual, but somebody who was driven by a desire for radical change, both in culture and in politics. And I think if you look at the really extraordinary list of enduring titles that he published from, I think they started publishing in 1952, 253, on right up until the end, when he got kicked out by the Gettys, and I think that was 1985, you see that the politics is sort of in the background. He published Frantz Fanon, he published the autobiography of Malcolm X, but that wasn't really at the forefront of what he was doing. What was really driving him and Grove Press was the cultural stuff. And yes, the erotica, as he liked to call it, some of this awful, awful stuff, in my opinion. And he'd get really angry if you mistakenly called, as I did, call it pornography in front of him. He'd get furious. But really, it's, the people we've mentioned, like Beckett and Genet, but also Marguerite Duras and Amos Tutuola, the palm wine drinker, and just really books that I just think some of the most extraordinary books from that period, from the 60s and 70s. He never published Nabokov, but I'm just thinking who else did he miss from that time?
He did a lot of Latin American stuff too, although I don't.
That's right, Octavio Paz, Juan Rulfo, wonderful, underappreciated writer. He didn't do as much Spanish as he, as much from outside Mexico as one might have wished. Yeah. But Paz, of course, so many.
He really did bring in the whole world to the United States, and I mean the United States, in terms of the taste of their readers, they've. If it's not about the U.S., they're very reluctant to read about it, at least.
I hate to hear you say that, Nigel.
Well, it might be a cliche, and it might be wrong or a stereotype.
Well, it's a joke among independent publishers that, if you really want to work to get your book not sold in the United States, all you got to do is put on the cover, translated by, and then sales go. But of course, there are serious exceptions to that rule. I mean, even in the benighted United States that I love, Name of the Rose was a huge bestseller, if not number one. And, there are plenty of others. And
well, especially these days.
Not so many others. Sorry?
Yeah. I mean, there's Knausgaard and Ferrante right now. you know. I mean, I guess they ride one horse, you know, and ride that to the end.
But what you say is absolutely correct. I think Barney, if not the pioneer, was certainly among the very first pioneers to push works in translation. I mean, you have James Laughlin at New Directions, starting a little before Barney, but also
Also from a rich family.
Yeah, you bet. Guided by Ezra Pound. I mean, because he started considerably earlier. But in terms of really reaching a mass audience, which I think Barney was keen to do. And I remember him telling me, you know, he wasn't in it. He wasn't so concerned with the idea of, in fact, he disliked the idea of a precious small press, you know, a letterpress. That wasn't his thing at all. No. He wanted to have paperbacks printed on cheap paper that were very reasonably priced, and he wanted to reach a lot of people. He wanted Samuel Beckett to be sold everywhere. And of course, it was many, many, many years. Beckett was one of his first authors. I think, in fact, I think it was his first year of running when he bought Grove, which had just up to that point done some reprints, 2 or 3 reprints from 19th and 18th centuries.
Yeah.
One of his first.
Melville. I think he did Melville.
Might have been. There was something called The Monk. Yeah. Oh, and then he did Henry James, The Golden Bowl. But then right after that, one of the very first contracts was with Beckett.
Yeah, actually, that's quite interesting because I saw an interview with Dick Seaver, an important editor with Grove for many years.
He was essential.
According to his wife, it was Dick who really discovered Beckett, and apparently went to the very first performance of Waiting for Godot and went to it a lot of times. But he doesn't show up at all in Barney's rendition of the story of how he came across Beckett. So,
I wonder if Genet Seaver would argue that, first of all, I think it's tricky to say who discovers an author. I mean, if Beckett were with us right now, he might wryly comment that he felt he was in the process of being discovered to his dying day. But if you mean who came first, I mean, Richard Seaver, who is a very brilliant editor and translator, published Beckett in, I think, Merlin.
That's
was
a magazine, right?
Right, a magazine in France, an English language magazine.
Yeah.
And then also worked with him in something called Transition. So, you know, Seaver may well have known and worked with Beckett. In fact, must have known and worked with Beckett before Barney. But I also think, just for the record, since you bring it up, that Barney independently, I mean, before he even knew of who Richard Seaver was, he had been introduced to Beckett by Sylvia Beach. I'm sure somebody like you knows exactly who that person was. She was the first publisher of Ulysses and ran Shakespeare & Co., which I believe to this day still exists. I remember seeing that store, I'm embarrassed to tell you, about 40 years ago. And even then it was, you know, this incredible repository. You just walked in and felt it was this repository of literary history. It was an amazing place. And I hope it thrives to this day.
I think it is, because they put a nice big cafe, right? They bought it finally.
Good.
But anyway, so you were saying...
She was in touch with Barney, and this is right after he had bought Grove, which was this tiny company, as I say, that had done 2 or 3 titles. I think in the memoir, unless I'm mistaken, we reproduced her letter to Barney, and then he got in touch with her, and they had a meeting, and she said, listen, there's this crazy Irishman that you have to hear about. And then they had this correspondence, which grew. That's in no way to diminish the importance of Richard Seaver as a translator and a skilled editor, but it is simply, I believe, inaccurate to say that he was the one who brought Beckett to Grove Press.
Okay, so 1951, he bought the company with his father's money, we should add. And it wasn't until about 1960 or 61 that he decided to, push for the publication of the uncensored version of Lady Chatterley's Lover. So, I wonder why that is. It was a definite campaign on his part, wasn't it?
Well, if you look even earlier, there's a few important dates that come before that. 1957, he starts up the Evergreen Review, and he does that at the time he saw it, and I think he was correct, as a very good marketing move, as a way to promote Grove Press, primarily to promote Grove Press authors. And in fact, I have a copy of the number 2.
Oh, that's fantastic. Look at that.
This is from 1957. This is number 2. He's listed as one of the editors. I think that's an important thing. Barney considered himself, at least at the beginning of Grove, as not just a publisher, an editor. You know, some of the names in this issue are Kenneth Rexroth, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Henry Miller, Michael McClure, Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Dory Ashton. I think one thing you and I might immediately notice is the paucity of names that are not white men. But this, I should come back to your point about what made him drawn to Lady Chatterley's Lover. But I think if you look at the evolution of Grove from the beginning, he's interested in books that challenge precepts and really push our limits.
Mm-hmm.
And he certainly had that in Lady Chatterley's Lover. He had it in Miller. He had it also in Beckett. You know, just about every one of the authors that I think were part of Grove's core, that's true. There's not one that's sort of commercially typical, and I think that's one of the reasons why Barney ended up basically without a penny to his name. But I don't know if I answered your point about the D.H. Lawrence.
Well, I was going to say, we kind of forget how subversive it was to sort of tell the truth and risk jail time like he did with Chatterley and Naked.
Thank you for mentioning that. People forget that in those days, publishers were actually thrown in jail for publishing what were called dirty books.
Yeah. So he took a huge risk, not just financially, but also risked his life in a way.
Yeah, I think that's very true. What drew you to him, actually? Why did you, because the memoir has been out now for a little while, what made you come upon him and decide that he was a figure you wanted to explore?
Well, okay. I mean, I've got this big grand mission to interview people about best practitioners in the publishing world in all sorts of different roles. So I'm just ticking off an important character here, basically. I've got a collection of about 400 or 500 publishers' histories and memoirs and that sort of thing. So,
well, I'm very glad you hit upon Barney, because I'm always frustrated when, for example, there's a otherwise wonderful book, Merchants of Culture, which I don't think mentions
Thompson,
mm-hmm. Which doesn't even mention Grove Press or Barney Rosset, which is, it's just, he's certainly someone who can be criticized, as I'm trying to do respectfully with you, but not to acknowledge how he really reshaped American publishing is a colossal omission. It would be like, I think, in some ways, trying to talk about 20th century painting and missing Picasso. But to go back to Lady Chatterley's Lover, I think he also strategically chose that because he knew there was a literary backing for Lawrence, and later with Miller too, that these could be seen as dirty books because they certainly have explicit scenes in them, and their authors' sexual obsessions become evident, or their protagonists in the books do. But Barney also was very aware that he would be taken to court. And in fact, was it with Lady Chatterley's lover? I think it was actually with Tropic of Cancer. The US Postmaster General took him to court for sending pornography through the mails in every single state in the Union. So Barney had to, separately. So Barney at the time had to defend Grove Press, or, concede the point, and being Barney, he was going to fight to the end, had to defend the case in every single state in the Union.
Which is a good thing for him if he wins, because then he doesn't have to go fight state by state.
Yeah, I can't remember how many court cases he ended up going through, but they were basically in court constantly. And as he says in his memoir somewhere, he enriched an entire generation of lawyers.
He fired London, right, early on. He found Cy Rembar, who actually was Norman Mailer's cousin. Well, one of the things that's interesting, just getting back to when he started up, is that in the early 50s, it's been called, let's see here, yes, the last great moment of reading and writing by a mass constituency. The paperback revolution kicked off in the 30s, and that combined with consumer affluence and faith in the word, would you say all of that sort of contributed to his success, his early success?
I think that certainly, and I think also his rise, and also coincidentally his fall, is in step with the rise of the baby boom generation. There's a whole bunch of kids coming of age who are coming out of the war period. There's this generation that's growing up in the late 50s, early 60s. They were getting frustrated, just as the current generation is right now getting frustrated with current prejudices and dunderheadedness, for want of a better word. And I think the 60s generation was looking around and then also there were a whole series of things that, Vietnam War showed, I think, in ways that would be very hard to miss, the perfidy of the U.S. government and its murderous consequences in many ways, that the police brutality is, you can draw some parallels between then and now.
You can. In fact, one thing that jumped out at me, you referenced his interest in film early on.
Yeah.
And he did make a film, and it was about racism in the United States. And that was, again, that was in the late 40s.
Yeah. I actually am embarrassed to tell you, Nigel, I haven't seen the film, but it was about a Black serviceman who comes back. He's a decorated serviceman who comes back to the States, and then the racism that he encounters there. It was well received. It was he did it with Haskell Wexler, somebody who was very close to for the rest of his life. But for whatever reason, making a film is a pretty involved process. I'm not sure why, but as I say, I'm very thankful that he did decide to turn to book publishing. I mean, I know how he came into book publishing is because a friend of Joan Mitchell, his first wife, Joan wanted him to get involved in something, and she said, "Why don't you, take up publishing?" And he sort of looked at this tiny company, Grove, that was for sale, and then bought it. But he remained fascinated by film for decades. And in fact, at some point he owned a theater. He brought over to the States a whole bunch of films.
He made a lot of money with I Am Curious Yellow, right?
Yes, with I Am Curious Yellow, they had a big hit. But some of the other ones, like last year at Marienbad, and then he was going to do something. Oh, he did make a film with Beckett called Film, but these were what we would call art films. They were not destined. They could not conceivably be for a wider audience. They were for a tiny number of viewers. But I Am Curious Yellow, that's correct. That was a huge success for him. But again, his spirit is, I can hear his spirit raging at me as I'm about to say this, but I think that when he was on the brink of financial success, he just did not want to do that. And he just turned away from that. If he had a lot of money, he wanted to spend it. He didn't want it to grow. He was not interested. In fact, he was very much against becoming, I think, financially successful. And he certainly succeeded in that. As I say, at the end of his life, he couldn't even pay the rent.
Yeah, that's sad.
But it was also, I think, a conscious decision. And
yes, yeah. Well, it's very anti-capitalist, isn't it?
Yes. But I mean, he had many, many successes in other areas and ways, but financially, that wasn't one of them. In fact, Grove, at least according to Grove's financial figures, which we got out of the Columbia archives, they were making money until about 1970, 71, at which point they lost a ton. That was also, the beginning of not the beginning, but it was when the feminist revolution really started to get going. And Barney totally missed out on that.
I do want to get to that. I just want to touch it a bit more on his fight against censorship. I guess the big question in the courts was, is obscenity an exception to the First Amendment? And there's a famous sort of standard definition, and that is whether the average person applying contemporary community standards and is the dominant theme of the material taken as a whole, does that appeal to the prurient interest? And so the big question is, so what's prurient?
And Barney, which I think undoubtedly his lawyers probably tried to keep him as much as possible from saying anything, his feeling, and in this I would certainly, I think most of us would agree with him now, is, even if it is prurient, why not? If people get a kick out of it, if it's not hurting anyone, more power to them if that's their thing. I personally would not want to publish that stuff so much, but, why not?
Well, in fact, I guess the approach with the lawyers was that if you could prove the social importance of the work, you wouldn't be accused of obscenity. And so their ploy was to get as many, quote, experts as they could to talk about the importance of the work and its literary value, to sort of talk about it being a classic, a modern classic. And I was just looking at, not as attractive as that early Evergreen review there, but this is Alan Lane's special little private printing of his fight for Lady Chatterley, right at the same time in England.
He was a great publisher.
The Penguin Books in the mid 30s, where, I mean, it wasn't his idea, but boy, he knew how to capitalize on it. But I'm just looking through the list of all sorts of people that that he called in as witnesses: Helen Gardner, Rebecca West, Richard Hogarth, E.M. Forster, Sir Stanley Unwin. Who did Barney's lawyers call in?
I just don't remember. I'm sorry. Don Allen was certainly, whom he met at the Columbia Publishing course, was a academic who advised him for years, and may well have been one of those he brought in. But I just don't remember. I
know. Evergreen was one of them. Okay, so he starts off his foreword with a good line. He says, "Some people think my chief claim to fame is having published the first book to be sold over the counter in this country with the word fuck printed on its pages in all of its naked glory. It was a major victory against ignorance and censorship." So that's obviously his greatest achievement.
I don't know about that. He has so many great achievements. I think for me, and in fact, that's how I got to know him, was through Beckett. I think publishing and championing Beckett was, and sticking with Beckett, because now you mention the word Beckett, and the cultural world, you can't conceive of it without a Beckett, right? Beckett says, I think, arguably up there with Shakespeare and maybe a couple of others. But when Barney got into contact with this guy in 52, Beckett was completely unknown. He was an acolyte of James Joyce. At that point, he's probably well into his 40s. He's not sort of a promising young writer. Right. He's an eccentric, very hard to understand.
He took a risk, didn't he? He took a huge risk, I guess. Is that it?
I think you could, whatever the word is that would go beyond risk. Fits in with my impression that Barney, if he could, he would go against the winds of financial success. To publish Beckett in 1950, to get excited about Beckett and to make a long-term commitment to this guy, it was a recipe for financial disaster. And you can justify it by, at the time, saying, I just think he's just an incredible artist and writer. But from a publishing standpoint, this was not something that Alfred Knopf was going to take on at the time, or, Mr. Schuster of Simon & Schuster. I guess that's a long way of saying that I think his greatest achievement was specifically to search out Beckett and to stick with him and to build him. Barney very consciously built up Beckett. Long before I think other publishers were doing this, he created a study guide and mailed out some vast number of study guides to high school teachers around the country. And this was a part of a very concerted marketing campaign, and did that for Waiting for Godot. And I don't know if he did it for other books, but this takes a tremendous commitment. And meantime, people like very real, solid literary critics like John Updike, who I have a terrible memory, but I happen to remember Updike wrote of Beckett very early on that Beckett was, quote, a plastic job for the intellectual fruit bowl, which is a great phrase, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find a person who was even glancingly familiar with Beckett today who would say that not just ridiculous. But Barney it is true that Barney was always obsessed with obscenity and censorship, and did some great things there, but I don't know if that was his greatest achievement.
Well, it's lucky that he had the financial backing of his father to be able to take this kind of risk. I suppose that's one thing that enabled him to do it. I mean, he got most of his money around 57. I think his dad died in 57 or thereabouts.
And before then, he had to basically, according to his memoirs, crawl on his belly to get. Yeah. But I mean, his father probably would have said with maybe some justification, geez, why don't you go get a job? Why are you always sponging off me? I think Barney also saw it as an opportunity to come into conflict with his father, that it wasn't something that he dreaded, it's something that he wanted. And maybe a Freudian would say that was an engine that powered him throughout his career.
Yeah, he's very combative. He really liked to fight, it seems. Any kind of fight.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. But it took somebody like that to go up against the US government. And even in some ways, there are several different kinds of censorship. So there was censorship about sex, but then also in some ways I think could very well argue that this modernist writing, of which Beckett is, the greatest example. There's commercial censorship. Who the hell wants to read this guy? So he went up against that too. That also takes a lot of fight, and he has to be recognized for that.
What about a couple of other publishers? Maurice Jerodian. Could you talk a bit about him?
He and Barney had a long and combative relationship. I never knew Jerodian, but I gather that he's a very interesting figure in his own right. I don't know if you ever got a hold of a copy. His memoir came out in 2 volumes, I think, The Frog Prince, and I've only read one. Are you going to show me? There it is. Look at that. And he has a absolutely essential place in modern literature as well. But he also was committed to publishing erotica.
Olympia Press, of course.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that he had, Barney's reputation went up and down. I think Maurice's, he was sort of famously, I don't want to slander the poor guy, but he was famously seen as a scoundrel of publishing, never paid his authors.
He exploited them, yeah.
Yeah, but really extraordinary. He did some amazing things too. He published something called, I think it was The Bread of Despair or something like that when he was in France, the Pain de whatever, really attacking André Gide, who, or maybe it was, I'm sorry, it might have been Malraux, who was the Minister of Culture at the time. Yeah. So he was, I think, a lesser version of Barney in France. And then he ended up coming to the States, where he tried to set up a publishing outfit and did something outrageous, some pornographic satire involving Kissinger and Nixon. I think he was thrown out of the States because of that, which might have been facilitated because of his expired visa. But, he was also a combative sort. I think Barney and he had some murky dealings. And for example, Barney reprinted the Olympia Reader here, and I think Maurice, argued that Barney didn't pay him, and who knows what the truth is behind that.
Yeah, I think Jerodian didn't really do a great job protecting copyright, for his own copyright.
That's right. At the time, I think copyright was that if something were published in English on the continent, then it was not covered by US copyright law. So technically, Barney didn't have to pay him anything and paid him probably a little something, but Maurice undoubtedly felt it wasn't fair, and he may have had a point.
Well, yeah, basically, Barney cannibalized the Olympia list, really.
I'm sure that's true.
What about John Calder?
Calder was someone whom I had some dealings with and great affection for. He was a remarkable publisher, as I'm sure you know, at least when he was in the States. Again, the scion of, I guess, a distinguished family. But in the States, when he would come and peddle his wares, he would get a station wagon and he would drive around the country and go from bookstore to bookstore selling his books. But he was somebody I think might have been the first to publish Beckett in the UK.
Yeah, that's his claim to fame, I think.
I don't think it's his only one. He published many other interesting authors. I'm sure a whole bunch of which are on the Grove list.
Yeah.
And like Barney, he ended up not exactly with a large bank account. These guys started. They did a great job in living up to the adage that the way you end up with a small fortune in publishing is you start with a big one. But in their cases, they ended up with nothing.
Well, and so what happened then with Barney is what for feminism really, it was kind of a backlash, I think, that got him.
I think that's true. That was part of it, and part of it was it just came up against his this personality that did not know the meaning of the word compromise or flexible in any way, shape, or form. And he saw it probably as another attack, personal attack, which in some ways it was on him. The offices were occupied, and he saw it probably as another, and I think he might even have said this at some point, that it was a CIA or FBI instigated plot in the same way they went after, which they really did go after the Black Panthers, as we know. I don't think so. I think it was he, really to the end of his days didn't treat women fairly.
Right up front, doesn't he? He talks about them as being objects, he admits that right up front in his memoir.
Yeah, and the very few women whom I think he really adored Joan Mitchell, but she walked away from him.
Yeah.
It's not so clear, I think, in the book, but historically, I think that is the case. She was the one who said, this is not going to last. And he always spoke about her.
Well, again, he spends a lot of time on this high school sweetheart, Nancy, who Haskell Wexler ends up marrying.
Right.
So he loses out on her too. And he was completely gaga over her.
That's right.
For years.
Yeah. So the ones that got away, the ones that spurn him are the ones that really he's sort of stays in love with. Yeah.
You talk about the occupation of the offices, and someone called Robin Morgan tries to organize or unionize.
She later, I think, became one of the first publishers of Ms. Magazine. She wasn't just, rabble rouser, but these were people who really deserved to be heard, and I think correctly felt they weren't. And Barney made a big error in not working with his staff. I think that was the turning point for Grove, and it started a period of a long, long decline, which ate up. Grove had made money, for a number of years, which even in those days for a publishing house was not to be assumed at all. But that was the beginning of a long decline, which ended up, as I say, in the mid-'80s with its basic collapse, and him selling out to the Gettys, who he wrongly felt, they wanted the company, so they wanted him. But I was there, and they got rid of him pretty quickly.
Where did Weidenfeld fit in? Because didn't he buy it, or?
I'm not a fan. His lordship.
I like his I like his memoir. It's pretty.
I haven't read his memoirs, but I knew him a bit. He had fallen in with Anne Getty, and Anne Getty unaccountably was really, I think, awestruck by him. I guess he talked a good game, and he convinced her that what she needed to do was to buy Grove Press. And then he convinced Barney that, look, you got to come in on this thing with me, and these people are perfect. We'll buy the company, we'll leave you alone, and everything will be just hunky-dory. And Barney, I don't want to say he fell for it, but he jumped at it because he had a pretty strong ego, and he thought, of course I'm going to stay on. He was a wild guy, even late in his life, and starting the day with a rum and coke, and the Gettys and their financial advisors, who included, I think, a former secretary of the Treasury, of the United States Treasury. This was a little bit more than they bargained for, and they got rid of Barney pretty damn quick.
Did Weidenfeld stab him in the back?
I don't know if that's fair to say, but Weidenfeld wasn't too worried about Barney. Weidenfeld then brought his operation to the States, and in short order, they were losing millions and millions of dollars. They had very fancy offices in the HarperCollins building, and they were losing a lot of money, a lot more money, I will say, than Barney ever lost. as I say, I was there at the time. I made the transition to the new Grove and stayed on for a little while before this was not the sort of publishing that I was interested in, and I left.
Why wasn't it what you were interested in?
My introduction to publishing was Barney's Grove Press, which was this maybe outdated model of a independent publisher, in Greenwich Village. He was on Houston Street at the time. And I thought that was great. And, the struggle and the fighting was really exciting. And I just didn't want to work for a big company in Midtown with, board meetings and stuff.
Profit and loss statements.
Well, in the case of Grove under Weidenfeld, it was all loss. It was a huge, they lost vast amounts of money.
And they did that because what? They published the wrong stuff, obviously.
You could say that, if they'd published bestsellers, they would have been making money. But they brought in Harry Evans, who's, brilliant, wonderful editor and publisher. They gave him an office the size of a football field.
He was a newspaper guy.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad idea. A lot of connections. But as I say, they gave him an office the size of a football field, or maybe half a football. It was the biggest office I'd ever seen. Huge in 53rd on 53rd Street in Midtown Manhattan. This is supposed to be a literary book publisher. You can't do that. Very lavish parties and cute big contracts. They lost. That was a recipe for disaster. And then they ended up eventually where it still is. Grove ended up in the very capable hands of Morgan Entrekin, a very different publisher from Barney, but really a very good one. Someone, I think, who has a much better handle on the business side of things.
Was Barney a good businessman?
That's a cruel question, Nigel. If a businessman is someone who's supposed to make a lot of money, evidently he wasn't, right? But he managed to hold together this operation through, several decades.
He knew how to find talent, right?
That is well put. Richard Seaver was one of the earliest people whom he worked with, but many other great editors. For example, Herman Graff became Carroll Graff, and Kent Carroll, who brought, Confederacy of Dunces had been published by Louisiana University Press or LSU Press, something like that. It was the paperback version that Grove got. They introduced it to he recognized it. For Kent, it still is a brilliant editor and publisher. And Don Allen, who brought in some of the Asian writers. Yeah. And a number of other people. Just
finally, one of the most disturbing things these days is how ubiquitous porn is on the internet. And, if I had a young son entering his teens, I'd be pretty uptight about the message he gets about women as objects.
Speaking as a father of three young people who have recently escaped teenagerdom, they went through a period that's unimaginable to you and me. All you do is turn on your computer, poof, and just looking, even leaving personal connections aside, just looking at the young people I see in the streets, who are really leading these protests, they seem pretty damn intellectually healthy to me. I think Barney was right about that. That's not what's going to hurt or pervert our youth. What's much more likely to do so is, these nutty notions of nationalism and intolerance of, if you want to dress a certain way, if you have a different sexual preference, there's something wrong with you. Or if your skin color is a certain shade, then you're really destined to be this or that. That's much, much more pernicious than seeing nude pictures of ourselves.
It's funny, when I thinking about it, I was reminded of the fact that when I was a teenager, I was a really huge fan of My Secret Life.
Frank O'Hara, right?
No, it's by an anonymous Victorian gentleman about his sexual practices. And I read that back and forth so often because, I wouldn't have read it if I was growing up in these days.
I had to bear the burden of for a short period, I had to oversee what was left of Grove's line of Victorian erotica, which, by the way, were real Victorian books that Barney had found somewhere. The story I remember he told me, and maybe it's in the book, is that he was passing a construction site in Greenwich Village and these books were being thrown out, and he took up armloads of this Victorian trash, and then he got hooked. But an actual title I remember, and they were just awful books, was I don't know about My Secret Life, but was Ravished on a Railway, which this stuff was awful. I personally, I'm very glad the culture has graduated from that to whatever it is, porn tube or something.
Well, the book is Barney Rosset's memoir. It's called Rosset, My Life in Publishing and How I Fought Censorship. It's published by Orr Books. And I've been talking with John Oakes about this great, controversial, driven publisher. Thanks so much for your time.
Nigel, thank you very much for having me on. Appreciate it.